And we're in. Oh, welcome. Hello. Back to the Capacity Conversations. We are two women from each coast of the United States having a challenging dialogue about self trust, transformation, and the reality every human is facing today. Do we actually have the capacity to do the things that we want to do? My name is Miriam Raquel Sands. I go by my middle name Raquel, and I'm on a mission to help millennials and Gen Z find their path, their purpose in the time of disruption, AI, economy. And I'm here today to have that kind of conversation around disruption and capacity, and all the other things with my co-host Sarah. And I'll hand it over to her so she can introduce herself.
My name is Sarah Liljegren. I am so honored to be with you, Raquel, for our second conversation around capacity. And I'm on a mission to rewild real estate and bring systems of mainstream community and in the real estate space closer to the nature connection that it seems like, looking at history, we used to have. So I'm looking forward to setting the table of what has been so that we can understand where we are and help us decide where we're going. So
that's right. That's right. That's so beautiful. Thank you. So today's episode, the first episode, I guess, to just quickly, was about our origin stories. So if you haven't checked that out, feel free. We are people who talk a lot, have a lot to talk about. And so grab a cup of tea or beverage of your choice, so you can hear our origin stories and about us, our businesses, and things like that. So today we're going to talk about time. We're going to go back in history, kind of open some maybe not so healed wounds. So if there's anything triggering, we don't have any quite disclaimers, but just be forewarned that there may be things that come up in this episode that don't sit well for some reason or other. And we're going to talk all about how did we get here, basically. The macrocosm of history, culture, context, and then the microcosm using the US, using North America specifically as its own mini universe, which it is, and talk about capacity and how we used to have it, how it's shaped us now. For context, the definition that we'll be using for capacity is the ability to hold, process, respond, and reimagine paradox in our bodies, in our systems, in our cultures. So how can we hold binaries and dualities? Because it's really not about either or. We're talking about both and. And we'll both expand on this and use this definition differently, evolvingly. So just bringing some baseline there. Anything to before we start, Sarah, because I know we got a lot.
No, that covered it. We're gonna dive deep.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah.
So to paint a picture, I'm taking the macrocosm today. So using this reference of the past is catching up to us all. I'm going to start a little bit with myself to kind of get us going. From the previous episode, I mentioned my lineage from my name that reflects the colonization and the slave trade and kind of the geopolitical, global north, global south dynamic in a person, in me. So the reason I start this is because we're gonna take it back to the beginning. I don't know if in biblical terms or however people resonate, but we're gonna try and bring some context to the history and how history repeats itself in ways, consciously, unconsciously, and how we are being affected by it, whether we realize it or not. So what did capacity look like before capitalism, before hierarchy, and before this grind, hustle and bustle? As I mentioned, I'm starting with myself. So my ancestry is very much both African and Latin American, both of which have been colonized. And before that, they were tribes. They were, and maybe some still are, trying to hold on to those paths and those forms of living. But because of all this process of agriculture and all these other technology revolutions, so much has been lost in terms of language, nervous system, all of that. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite books called Ishmael. And also we will have a link, a reference of all of our different books and resources. So Ishmael is a fiction book or fictional resource. And there's this quote in the book that goes, "There is no one right way to live." And the whole thesis of this book is between the takers and the givers. And being a tribal person, someone who lives with the land, which was how we all used to live. We're not being a taker. We're not necessarily being just extracting, like capitalism has told us that we should be or that we should do. So I want to start with there because I'm not trying to belittle people or belittle ourselves for how we're living now. This is where none of this has been a choice for any of us. So before burnout and bulleted pointed schedules and hustle culture, we were just people. Homo sapiens is the species that we all operate under. So we're not just job titles, we're just human beings in rhythm with the land, the season, and story. That was all we had before. So giving some stats, the Homo sapiens existed for 300,000 years. 95% of that time, we were foragers, hunting, gathering, moving with the seasons. Only in the last 10,000 years, I'm not great at math, but that feels like less than a third. So only 10,000 years did we settle and farm and build empires. And now, as we know, we have the normal, quote unquote, 40-hour plus weeks and things. So setting the stage, this was not our reality. We were all living under stars. We were all naked or half naked. We were all very much vulnerable and in touch with each other and Earth. Another quote from Ishmael: "Mother culture says this is how it's always been, but this is only how it's been for a blink." So we have been so, if you all know the movie The Matrix, indoctrinated to believe that this is how we've always been, is just technology and whatever else. And that's why the reference in the book is mother culture instead of mother nature, because we've been disassociated from that. Social life was rhythmic. It was not rigid. Among the Bayaka, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing anything, and the Bikiawara, I think these are two different tribes, there were the leadership, rituals, and even names of the individuals changed seasonally. So if we can imagine a time when our identities, our sense of selves was not set in stone, and there was a way in which we all operated circularly, you know, I think there's pictures of biology and things where nature is everywhere. The cosmos are reflected in the cells of organisms and in trees. And so thinking about how we used to be seasonal and circular. Franz Boas, again, I'm going to not pronounce this correctly. Kakwa, I'm so sorry. The notion that in that tribe, in that group, hierarchy, so we're talking about structures of power, peaked in the wintertime and then dissolved in the summertime. And I'm trying to pull out references so that we can start to think about our current structures very differently, that they flipped, and perhaps that's intentional, perhaps not. And so it's very interesting that societies often reverse power structures during dry, rainy seasons. Again, going back to the cyclical, we were very much in tune with nature. So human societies practiced built-in resets. So there was a cyclical approach to power, community, and care, identity. Imagine a society where your leaders step down every summer, where rituals of mourning only happened when the earth was dry, where even your name changed depending on the season. There were no fixed institutions, no work weeks, no burnout. Foragers lived in fission fusion, And I got that as a direct quote, groups. People came together or dispersed depending on needs, not rules. Spiritual life and survival were interwoven. So astrology gets, I think, a bad name, bad rep now because it's very woo, but astrology was the science of the day. It was called astrology, but looking up into the stars for guidance, to name people, to give birth or have alliances. There were no central governments, no landlords, no clocks. The economy was relational, based on reciprocity, not extraction. I'm going to reference this book, Homo Sapiens. I think the author, Harari, is an anthropologist. And he says foragers had better knowledge of their environments, more varied diets, more leisure time than the average peasant. We're going to get into that of later eras. So this was all before agriculture. We haven't even got into the agriculture in revolution yet, but just setting the stage that this was a time and place where we had a time and place. There was no rush, there was no identity, or trying to figure it out, because everything was built in through the community, through the environment. There was no need to create borders, mental borders, physical borders. Everything was synced and in sync, like the intuition and intention and all of that was what gave harmony of the day. I'm going to stop there because I want to just ask Sarah if I need to clarify or if I need to slow down or just anything. Trying to gut check.
I was thinking of that practice of the emperor has no clothes. That we don't, I think about that a lot because we don't see that. We don't see today our leaders come down and be one of us, at least in a ritualistic, like public way. I see it in little glimpses, I suppose. Something else you said was really beautiful. I wrote down this was a time and place where we had no time and place, because I think a lot about place and place making. And of course, time and our relationship to time. And it's hard to imagine living with the seasons in that way. I mean, in modern day, so it's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Okay, great. So we'll continue because now I want to take us, we're still going back in time or like forward in time. So the shift begins. So we were tribes, we were living in accordance with nature. If you're listening to this audially and you want to visualize yourself in just barefoot, naked, however your ancestry, if you don't know, just place yourself in nature in a place and feel how that would have felt. So now we're starting to shift from the vulnerable, from just being in the womb, I guess. And now we're shifting into agriculture. So most of my references here are from two different books. One is called Guns, Germs, and Steel. I love this book. Sarah's smiling. We have so much in common. Oh, did you want to say? I'm like waiting. Okay, no. Sorry. Okay, I'll keep going. And then the other book is Sapiens. So both of these books have a wealth of knowledge. I would also just hint and say that, there's so many resources that could counteract, like there's always one side, there's always two sides to every coin. So as we mentioned, resources, explore those and explore ones that counter attack or whatever it is. Like, these resources aren't meant to cover all the things, is I guess what I'm trying to say. But I will be pulling from these because I feel like they are the most holistic or comprehensive. So from Guns, Germs, and Steel and the book Homo Sapiens, agriculture allowed food surplus. So if we talk about how the earth started changing from Pangea, from all these tectonic plates, forcing people, Mother Earth, creating the change for people to cross continents that would have otherwise, people would have never been able to cross from Africa to parts of Asia or parts of Europe. And so that created the backbone. or the backdrop for agriculture, I would say, as someone who is not an anthropologist or anything like that. And partly because with environmental changes, food, the seasonality, the relationship to all of that starts to change. So people started to realize how to make things. I mean, we can talk about technology here as well, and starting the need for that. But basically, the biggest picture that I want to paint across is that agriculture and tribes, instead of being nomadic, settling down, becoming settlers to certain extents, that really started to change the game because hierarchy was created based off of agriculture. Once people had a seat in the land and were able to harvest and start to extract and control the land and adapt, make the land adapt to them versus where we were adapting to the land before, it created this reverse. It created this this different 180 where farming did not liberate us. It bound us to routine, property, and hierarchy, because the more that the tribes had to settle down and instead of hunting and gathering and searching and being more at the cost of nature, now nature is at the cost of us. So there was a clear power dynamic. There was a clear nervous system, technological shift happening. And so we didn't just settle into farming, and we settled into things, patterns and ripple effects that we couldn't have foreseen. And all of those ripple effects we'll get into started creating different levels of inequality and power dynamics. So again, the big kind of billboard highlighter here is that humans couldn't have foreseen that trading the lifestyle, making changes because Mother Nature was making changes, not to put the blame on Mother Nature. She didn't know, we don't know. But that with things starting to get under our control, land, housing, culture, hierarchy, power dynamics, like once we started settling, oh yes. Go ahead. I was just doing a whole spiel. Please.
No, I was adding food. I was just saying food.
Okay.
Yeah,
yes.
Because that shift everything, even our brains and biology.
Yes, exactly. And like, who would have known that those things would have created so much change in lifestyle, in all these other things that we're now seeing, or we're now the descendants of. Because again, let me go back to my previous quote. I gotta scroll a little bit. Our species, Homo sapiens, have existed for 300,000 years, which in the lifespan of Earth is also nothing. But in our lifespan, or like the span of our group of animals, 300,000 years. And for 95% of that time, we were foraging. So we're this pivot that I'm talking about, agriculture, only in the last 10,000 years did we settle, farm, and build empires. So that means that we've had no time. There has been no time from our ancestors to now to adapt, to get into the swing of things, to understand, to metabolize. And I mean that literally and figuratively. I mean, Sarah bringing in food, like, yes, I mean, us, instead of hunting and gathering, having control and containing food and domesticating food and animals and just so many other things, the psychology of all of that, the emotion, the spirituality. I haven't even touched on the institutions yet of religion and how, like, us settling has settled so much in terms of what is culture, what is power, what is economy. And, instead of reciprocity and instead of trading, we get into the development of money. We get into currency. We get into all these things that weren't a thing for 95% of our existence. Let me not lead astray with my other quotes. So basically, this Western narrative of the inevitable march that we were, humans are at the top because there was always this pursuit of something else. From poor to rich, from simple to complex, from hunting and gathering to agriculture. And then, as we're going to see, the Industrial Revolution. Like, that's a myth of progress because, again, 95% of the time, we were fine, more than fine. We were thriving in all levels: emotional, physical, economical, environmental, big, because we wouldn't have been able to survive or do anything without Mother Nature. So complete 180 in this last, what was it? I don't want to butcher the 10,000 years. So complete 180 of dynamic here. There's another book that I referenced. I haven't read it, but I got this quote specifically for this. Human societies were wildly diverse, experimenting with different ways to organize life. So what we lost wasn't progress, it was possibility. And this is from the book, The Dawn of Everything, from Graeber and Wengrow. I'm going to pause here because I do want to transition into what we can call the Great Shift from agriculture to what we now know, I guess, as empire and what we study about in history. But let me just pause. And Sarah, anything you're picking up that I'm putting down? Or like,
yeah, I'm writing this down because the myth of progress going from poor to rich. Another theme I think about constantly is redefining wealth. I bought this house that I'm living in. I've lived here for about a month and a half. And the asset of having an established garden, I can go into all the ways that it has provided me more comfort and wealth than monetary value can describe. Just to show up and have an established garden, like this place was stewarded well. What a gift.
Yeah.
And from like wild to domesticated. And I wanted to ask you,
Yes.
what do you think the dangers of a wildly diverse tribal culture are? Because I watched this movie, I don't recommend it, called Bone Tomahawk. I mean, if you're into gore and weird stories, it's fine. But it's an example of in the pioneer era in the West, tribes that were isolated and extremely dangerous. And I hear about stories like this because I'm interested in developing eco-villages and American culture and how to reestablish that kind of culture. And I ask this, like, what happens if isolated communities who are sovereign in their isolation become so diversified that we war? And we're seeing this today. So what do you think about that?
This is so timely, and this is gonna be a jump to the future for a bit because, and part of my answer, I listen to this podcast called The Diary of a CEO. I think I sent you the link. Check it out when you can. And he brought a panel of an evolutionary biologist, an AI kind of coder, and then an entrepreneur. So he was kind of like the middle way.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I don't know why an entrepreneur is the middle way, but okay.
Because they are.
So I just say that because that's the context for my answer. They talk about the Amish in the episode and have the Amish, for those who aren't aware, Amish, and I'm not an expert, but what I understand of the Amish is they're a group of individuals in rural Pennsylvania on the East Coast of the United States. And they live in their own communities, practicing their form of Christianity, their own belief system. But the way they live is like in the 1800s. So there's no electricity. There's no modernization comforts. But they still coexist. So they're in their bubble, and then they sell and they try to deal with the economy and all these things. So that came to mind when this question of wildly diversifying and like the tribes, because I wouldn't say they're a tribe, but I feel like they're trying to be wild in an environment. Like one of the panelists on the episode said, you can choose to get off of the escalator, but choosing to get off, again, like there's no right or wrong. There's no right way to live, according to Ishmael. But everything faces its own consequences, because getting off the escalator means that we have to be comfortable with the choice, or like the tribe or the group of people have to be able to swallow that pill,
Right.
red or blue from the Matrix. I'm kidding.
Yep.
But swallow that responsibility of, are we willing to burden ourselves with being on the escalator and all that comes with that, AI, hint, hint, and all these things, or not? And I think I'm personally trying to get off the escalator, because I know that from what I've seen, being in corporate space, trying to juggle a business, and living in an apartment in Northern Virginia, the cost, like the economy. And so my husband and I want to be homesteaders, and we want to have community that also wants what we want. It's the values. So I have no problem. I feel like if the group of people and the communities, you know, are weighing the risks, are weighing that we are creating our own world that perhaps could adjacently work, and maybe be influenced, but we're stepping off the escalator. I don't know the particular dangers. I feel like the economic would be a big one, and the technology, but I mean, for the nervous system and the emotions and the mental, and for the longevity, honestly, of what it means to be human, I feel like the dangers outweighs. So.
Yeah, lovely. The last thing I'll just note, and then you can move on, is I had an anthropologist friend one time I asked about this, and he, in his research, he decided that I don't think there's a right way to live. So echoing what you're saying, and he said, but I do think there's a wrong way to live. And it seems like, because I'm from Missouri, and Southern Missouri has a big Amish culture, and being on the highway with a lot of cars and just seeing horse and buggy on the side of the highway next to you is I remember in the car with my family saying, like, I love that. I love them. I mean, hearing about how the Amish have integrated into their local culture was very supportive. And I think what might be wrong is to demonize and attack, which we do see among different in the culture wars, and I'll get into that later. But and I think that, just to highlight the right and wrong, I'm relearning my sense of that. And I think the demonization of your neighbor might be.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. No, thank you. Yeah, because I think that's all of this is I think what we're trying to weave as just part of this whole episode is that capacity and time and energy, effort, like we're not here to belittle or say this is what people have to do. What for context, for those listening and watching, this episode is meant to paint the picture. We're trying to paint the mosaic so that we can all have as much knowledge is power, under our belt, because what I'm trying to say in my spiel of this episode is that we as humans haven't had time to adapt, to learn, to understand. There just hasn't been. And so we are all handicapped. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I just mean that we have been, as a group of individuals, as a group of animals, and we're not able to catch up. I mean, there will never be, because so the great shift, the part 2 that we're coming into, is the effects of agriculture, which is what we're currently dealing with now. And we're going to jump ahead into the future, AI in other episodes, but it's like, just give ourselves some grace, because there are groups of people still now in the Amazons. The Amazon are being obliterated. And the Amazon is like the lung of the earth. And there are still tribes still trying to be rewild, still trying to do their thing. The Amish, there are Native Americans on reservations in this country there's just groups of people that have constantly been overstepped, belittled, and the whole neighbor thing. Like, I think there's even a concept of not in my neighborhood, of people who go to jail or certain things that support civilization, electric units. I don't know. But like there's this concept of other, and that's not who we were as people, as humans. So with all of that, um, this is the hinge in the human story, the part where everything turns. So we're turning the page now, where we went from living with the land to owning it, from dancing in the rhythm to time to being ruled by it. Because time is a construct, also, you all. The sun doesn't know that it's going up and down on our little planet. Like we, okay, I can talk about how humans think they're full of themselves in another episode. Oh, oh my gosh. Okay, so let's get into agriculture before I completely lose my shit. Around 10,000 years ago, in multiple parts of the world, humans began domesticating plants and animals. So domestication is not natural. You know, having a little French bulldog next to me is not natural. Me sitting in front of this monitor for 8 hours a day is not natural. From the book Homo sapiens that I keep referencing, the agricultural revolution was history's biggest fraud. It promised abundance, but delivered longer hours of labor, monotonous diets, rising inequality, population booms that outpaced resources. This is what we're living, you all. I mean, we feel like the agricultural revolution was, I don't even know, like hundreds of years ago, but it's still like we're still doing it. I mean, there are still farms for salmon, for cows, for chickens, and I mean, there's so many things. The domestication of us, of animals, of Mother Nature, that is what we're all dealing with. So that's where we're at. From the book Guns, Germs, and Steals, the quote is, surplus food led to population density. Because of course, if we're settling in one area of square footage or whatever, that creates cities, that creates crows and mice and squirrels to be able to feed off of humans and create this, what we think, I think, reciprocal relationship between other humans or other animals, but we're all forced because we're all contained. So we can now have armies, we can now have bureaucracies, we can now have centralized power because everything is contained and controlled. From the book, direct quote from Sapiens, we didn't domesticate wheat, wheat domesticated us. And if you ever do a road trip in the United States, you will see the large plains of wheat. If you've seen any documentaries like Food Inc., or I can't mention all of them, but just seeing how we just have groups of and herds of animals bunched up so that we can nourish and feed ourselves and go through this cycle of birthing and kids having problems because of what people are putting in the animals, in order for us to, I don't know, everything is in service of control is what the agriculture. So that's the agriculture piece. We used to be tribal, we used to be nomadic. So from mobility to property. And I know my girl Sarah knows all about this, so I'm just gonna highlight, I'm not gonna dive too deep. But from kinship to ownership. So there was never this legality, administrative process. I'm sure that between generations, the land we didn't own the land. And the land didn't own us. It was just, we lived, we died, we're all part of the circle of life. But now there are these hierarchies because now that we own land and we have to stick to it, there is this, we start to talk about generational wealth and the people who are at the top, making sure that their descendants have and the path to that. So we start getting into the legal structures. Nomadic life was replaced by settlement. Land became owned. Borders were drawn. So here is when we start to get into that piece of, the carving of Africa and the carving of Latin America and these big, we're going to talk about colonization a little bit. But all of this is to say that work became a concept, because before there was no concept of work. We just existed. We all just woke up and hunted, gathered, bared children, reared children, coexisted with the cosmos, and that wasn't seen as work. But now that we have to fulfill certain obligations and make sure that the containment, everything is controlled, work becomes an obligation, not contribution. Just to highlight a little bit now, women's labor, when in the foraging societies, when we were all in tribes, there wasn't this distinction about men versus women and the patriarchy and things like that. So now we're starting to see the development of patriarchy, because now that things are controlled, the individuals who have more of the power and who gave themselves legal power, institutionalized power, were the men. And the ones who, I mean, I look at what religions don't have a man at the top. Like all the Abrahamic religions have a man at the top. And I'm not saying don't believe those things. I'm just saying we can look at them for what they are and still believe what we want to believe. But it's just interesting how the development of these things after Christ, or, you know, all these things. So we talk about the development of patriarchy here. Agriculture created patriarchy. Who knew? And so from the book Homo sapiens, the rise of private property transformed relationships, because children became possessions. Children became assets. To have a big family, to have wealth, to be able to distribute wealth, and not just let the cosmos be, like, let's just live by the cycles. No, now we have a path of what's mine and what's theirs. And I don't want to just take things by chance. I don't want to just trust the universe. Now I have to create the universe, and I have to create order. And this is how my child or my family, how I will be known. Like now we start getting into, what does it mean to have authority? So all of these philosophical and all these things started to happen. The birth of empire. So sacred order was swapped for social stratification. So we get into kings and priests and scribes because we start talking about technology. The birth of writing, you know, we've always been very creative animals. And I keep saying animals because whales sing, like all animals are awesome. So come for me. But you know, all animals have their thing. Like in all the documentaries, we see how there's mating calls and different rituals. So that starts to evolve. We get writing. We start getting more formalized forms of literature and music and things. Again, control. This instead of us just being, now we're doing. Now we're being controlled and we're fixated on things. Time becomes linear. We talked about the cycles. So before, everything was cyclical, and identity, hierarchy, relationships. I'm sure there wasn't a thing about polyamory versus monogamy, because it's just, you know, we're just all, yeah.
I'll get into that too.
Okay, good. Okay, great. I'm just foreshadowing you all. Sarah's going to do all the great work.
Well, you're doing the macro, and I'm going to bring it into the micro.
Yes, thank you. And so yeah, time was not linear, but now, you know, the development, and I'm kind of condensing a bit, agriculture with the industrial revolution, with, because it's all in the same, again, 10,000 years of Homo sapiens. I'm not trying to cover all the details, but again, painting the brushstrokes here, that time gets moralized. You know, we don't just enjoy our moments. What does it mean to be productive? We have to work on the farm. We have to start to show up and perform certain duties, and not because we want to, or because there's this intuitive, intentional, organic calling to do so, but now there's a king, now there's a duke, now there are people in charge of us, of our capacity, of our time. After Christ, I just have a bullet here, the rise of salvation through suffering. So there's these, I haven't touched too much on the religion, but if we think about the tribes and the the being in nature, the reciprocity with nature, and how a lot of I think indigeneity is in relationship to that. Not that we are superior, but now religion and ways of thinking, feeling are about there's a certain amount of control. Like you have to go through this in order to feel that. You have to do these certain things, which I think ritual has always been, but now again, it's more contained, it's more in time. The development of Christmas, like Christmas was not a thing. We can unpack, we definitely will unpack all of this religion stuff, but please, Sarah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, that's just a big part of what I'm getting into, because bringing it down to the micro, into American culture, Puritanism was a flavor of our founding, and religion and its impact we live in, whether we want to or not. And it's worth understanding. Yeah, for sure.
It's worth understanding. Exactly. Yeah. So all of the things that we are now have been trickled onto us. This is like the cultivation of that. From the book Guns, Germs, and Steels, religion and ideology served as the scaffolding for empire, convincing people that hierarchy was natural or divine. Because again, if we're coming from tribal and cyclical, there was no need for hierarchy, because what is a circle? It's not a pyramid, and it doesn't have edges. So a circle just goes, it flows. And so now that everything is contained, we're boxed in, and we're still boxed in, hint, hint, homes and cubicles. Like we're on this Black Mirror right now, we're boxed in. But it's the only way I can connect with you. So having these hierarchies is getting intentional. We're gonna just brief brushstroke colonialism. So we're developing land, we're developing containment, we're developing control. And then what happens when you have power? You want more power. Well, maybe not all of us, but like those who had power wanted more power. So we get into colonialism here. Empire by expanding through extraction. So we're extracting from Mother Earth, we're extracting from the people who live on that earth through economy, through taxes, development of money. And now people are expanding. They've got ships. They feel like they're entitled to search for their religion, for their more economy, wealth creation. So what began with farming expanded with steel, guns, germs, and technology, which is why that book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, is named as such. So the indigenous time, land was appropriated, not just physically, but, can I pronounce this? Epistemologically. Okay. I'm not saying that 3 times again. So we're talking about capacity that we're just born with it, to being controlled by it and being contained, and now it's being stolen from people, because who would have known that the people who had ships and whatever else had an intent? Like everybody in these different groupings has a certain intent. Again, there's no one right way to live, but they, I think, really believed that their way was the way. So we're not talking about just labor here, but people's cultures, rituals, relationships to themselves, identity. So mass erasure of culture, the development of plantations, missionary schools, the standardization of rhythm, and erasure of knowledge. Because a lot of these cultures were oral, and still cyclical, still wild. And now these groups of people who were off the escalator are being forced on the escalator, their sense of identity, their sense of culture. This is not in my notes, but something that's coming to me is, I watched this episode from, again, the Diary of a CEO, and he talked about how when he worked with a dermatologist, I don't know where the dermatologist got her training, but kudos to her, because she talked about how there is a consistent deficiency in vitamin D and certain things in colored people, Black, brown, because of this physical displacement from the global South to the global North. They were living in sunny areas. I mean, Africa, Latin America, and moving into the North where it's colder, it's less humid, it's less sunny. And as a descendant, like now sunscreen is sacred and being in the sun is sacred. So anyways, I just felt called to share that. But we're talking about how Eurasian empires used their mental, their wealth, economy, and power in agriculture and started to conquer others. A quote I have here is, colonialism wasn't just a theft of land, it was a theft of rhythm, capacity, and of cultural memory. So I have some other notes here about Greek philosophy and Christianity, labor becoming a moral imperative and rest becoming indulgent. So we're starting to, again, and I think all of this is in the mind. Like a lot of the dynamics and the structures that we're seeing or have existed are because of this containment. The more control leaves people to think about, now we have the division of classes, Karl Marx, perhaps, we can get into that, about the bourgeoisie. And why? Because now we're all cattle, we're all controlled, and we have been domesticated. I'm going to transition to the next one, but the last few pieces, with empire came laws, with markets came prices, and what was once a shared resource, time, energy, presence, it became a privilege, because the biggest thing is this division of labor, division of classes, division of my way or the highway, on the escalator, off the escalator. Like these are things that we can, copy and paste into different layers of the fabric of society. So we're no longer living for the collective, and we're surviving, the survival of the self. It's not even about being a group of a tribe. It's like I don't even know who I am anymore, because there's been this appendage. There maybe appendage isn't the word. There's been this cut, this division. I'm gonna stop there because I felt like that was a lot, and I want to give Sarah space as well.
Yeah, amputation of the appendage. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's this a teacher of mine made the connection of like how we have divorced nutrition from flavor, and I think about just that spiritual divorce that's happened culturally and historically, and you've spoken very well to that. So yeah, eventually I'll dive into how we live in that divorce.
Yes. Kids who don't have the nourishment.
Yeah. Do you have any practices that you want to speak to right now that I'm imagining some people listening to all this who have felt echoes of emotion, pain, positive, negative, anything, like a balm or a practice that you can offer right now?
Cry. And if it doesn't come up, that's fine. I really like earthing. So if people have access to a park, like it's hard to drive to nature. But if you can, putting your feet in the ground. I'm a tree hugger. I mean, really hug a tree. Like, who cares what people think? But if none of that feels comfortable, okay. if none of that feels comfortable or accessible, pray, meditate, journal, and let it free flow. Like I'm not trying to contain or control you. We do have prompts when I wrap up my whole session or section of this episode. And then before I hand off to Sarah, I'll leave you all with some prompts, but for the purposes of what we've just unpacked, In super general brushstrokes, I would say go earthing, go ground yourself in nature, really touch it, get your hands dirty. If you like gardening, if you feel called to have a plant in your home, you are a steward of that plant, of that life. And if you need to decompress, I would say journal, stream of conscious, pray. But nothing I offer is to be controlled. Like I'll give prompts in a little bit, but just as comfortably, as accessibly as you can, sit with the feeling. Find a tree to ground you. I have this tiger stone, calming stone. Journal, like just let yourself free, dance, like so anything somatic. They say shake it out, jiggle it. So I would say that just whatever wants to come out, just let it come out. This is not the time to be contained.
This is not the time to be contained. Not in this moment of history. No, ma'am. That's beautiful. Thank you, Raquel, so much. I was listening as I stepped out just now, and I was thinking of, and if you're watching the video, you're like, why does she keep leaving? We got started at 6:30 my time, and all I've had is coffee because wake up. Yeah, full caffeine this morning, bad for breast tissue, good for the mind. So, and I figured as I take over here, I could let that coffee and caffeine fuel me. And as I was listening to you describe your practices, which I think are so important as we talk about this, to give people something to connect to.
Yeah.
And I led a grief hike, I guess, a couple nights ago. That's been something in this new place I've lived I've been called to do, is bring people outdoors to connect over their own grief process, because that seems to be such an important thing to do right now. Yeah. We are stuck in the busyness to the degree that we're forgetting we feel. And most of us are feeling negative emotions that we just can't understand or comprehend or even talk about without, triggering somebody or pissing somebody off, or somebody saying, well, why don't you care about this? And we've talked about this before. Like, do we have to care about every single thing now? Like, I can look at war any second of every day on my phone. And I was thinking about the grief hike because a lady that I had just met who came to the hike, I was telling her what I'm interested in and what I do and trying to make eco-villages more accessible. And she's like, or you can just do it in your yard. And I was like, yeah, like there is, my desire is a systems thinking. I think about, systemic oppression and how to combat the systems of oppression that we live in. And also the true rebellion is doing it at home, and bring it home, bring it to your body, bring it to your life, and live as the best version of yourself you can. And that is just going to be we said earlier, there might not be a right way, but there is a wrong way. And if you feel like you are living in the right way, I think that's the most we can ask of ourselves. And by living in community, you have people to check you in the checks and balances system, to help you remember if that right way is actually wrong. So I'll pick it up from there, and we'll just dive into the micro of looking all that through history and looking at why is the American culture we're living in this way. And everything you just spoke to is living in us today. And so I would like to take us through some history of, essentially, I have chunks from 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? From 1492 to 1607 in at least North America, what we now call the United States. Within North America, what we call the United States, which I'm going to refer to as United States, not America, because the Americas are huge. And the United States is a specific flavor of culture that those of you living in right now are pretty like you're living in this adrenalated state like I am right now. So I think it's good that I'm gonna, I think, speak kind of fast and go through this from broad brushstrokes throughout history. So early colonization the first colony that we know of happened in 1607. And so in Jamestown. And so that was a mostly Anglican Church of England. They came because of trade, export, not necessarily religious reasons. But Plymouth in 1620, the Mayflower came to Plymouth Rock. They were, according to research helped by ChatGPT and AI, helped me organize my thoughts here. About half separatists, maybe. And in saying that, I have to say, anyone watching, you and I have both talked about AI. I have chosen ChatGPT to outline my thoughts here. That does not mean I fact checked every single thing down the rabbit hole. So if you're like, actually, this is true, Sarah, I really welcome that in the comments, because I want to have a very palm open approach to this conversation. I don't know everything about this history, but it's important to talk about, and it's important to highlight why we're here. So again, setting the table or the stage. And so by 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony became like the New England Puritan colony that a lot of people, a lot of founders of our country actually looked back and were like, with the religious freedoms, let's not be Massachusetts Bay. Let's give people freedom of religion, because the Salem witch trials were not a fun time. And a lot of people recognize that. So my question was like, what happened between 1492 and 1607 between what we now know as the first colony? And settlements, like I said, 1607 settlements weren't necessarily for religious reasons, but that came in later and was a very influential part of what is now modern law. So, and it was like some of the little colonies that formed just disappeared magically. There was native resistance for sure. And I think going back to technology, there was just such a clash in technology, and disease was a big one that we know later affected a lot of the native culture. So, and I was really interested in how Puritans really thought differently than the Church of England and the mainstream church of the time. So some of the Puritans were separatists from the Church of England because they thought the Church of England became too overwhelming and corrupt. And so that's an interesting thing, is that the extreme view of Puritans came from religious oppression, and then they created religious oppression. And so the paradox there. And how does Puritan shape American law? And a lot of that came from what is still, we still see today, blue laws, or what are called blue laws, enforced religious standards. And there are still dry counties in the United States, again, from Missouri, southern Missouri borders on, there was this county that I drove from Arkansas up into Missouri, and the biggest liquor store you have ever seen shined on the horizon on the Missouri border, because you couldn't buy liquor in Arkansas in that county. It was either on Sundays or you couldn't buy, and still it's just a funny thing. So remnants of religious ideals being upheld in laws is still around. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it's important to have some sort of moral code. The question now is, how do we incorporate all these different moral codes that we're fighting for? Compulsory education. If you've ever, I'm going to piss off some teachers probably, but Dumbing Us Down. Oh my gosh, I forget the author's name, but he was a teacher of the year, and he wrote a book about compulsory education and how it's actually not good for the human development systems. He highlights that really teaching people how to read takes a very short amount of time. You just have to wait until they're interested in learning how to read. And so in the United States, compulsory education laws say that kids have to be sent to be educated from about 5 years old to about 18 years old. I mean, we all know this. We all went to school. It didn't used to be that way. Like to your point earlier, Raquel, like we would learn in little villages and learn what was around us. And that's how we learned about our environment, how to be a part of our community. And so that's just a different way of seeing how to be a part of our community is now institutionalized. I mentioned in the last episode my personal lack of trust in the institutions, the education system, the justice system, the healthcare system. There's all these systems that seem to be breaking apart all around us, or at least the illusion of their trustworthiness and their intention to exist for our benefit and our support, I think that story is dying a little bit. We also went from a covenant theology. There was something called the halfway covenant. In 1662, this allowed, because I'm looking down for those of you who are on video a lot. If you're on audio, it won't matter a lot, but I'm going to be looking down to look at my notes so I can go in order here. The tight Puritan grip on church-state unity weakened. And so by 1662, they allowed church membership to the requirements for it to be a little loosened. And that's really interesting and worth noting, is because the new colonies that formed were under the control of religious ideals. And so those schools and like the laws that I mentioned were put into place so that there was some semblance of social order. And because they cared so much about the moral values, it made sense to establish their communities among their religious community agreements. And I, to this day, believe community agreements and co-housing agreements and all of that is so, so important. And it's worth having a clear intention. And so again, not to demonize their intentions here, but because religious ideals were put into social constructed orders, people rebelled, right? They were like, I don't actually think this is good for us. So what the church did was allowed people not of such strict conversion experience related, having those heavy conversion experiences. More people were just allowed into church. And so more people got to understand like the faith. And I started getting curious about, well, what was the difference between the Puritan teachings and Jesus's true teachings? And it's almost like their desire to be so godly created almost like an anti-loving kindness faith, which was actually, I believe, in the heart of Jesus's teachings. And so there's this paradox of, people started to rebel against that. Something really to keep in mind is that people will die for their sovereignty, no matter what. If you back people into a corner with however good intentions, people will die for their sovereignty. So that started to cause a reform into going into 1700. Like, more people deserve a faith and a moral code than just the clergy of our town. It wasn't just church members who had a say in how society went anymore. And so that led into the Great Awakening into the 1730s, all the way into the 1740s or 60s. There was a massive revival movement that emphasized personal faith, emotional conversion, and individual Bible teaching. Teaching more people how to read often started with, we're going to learn how to read the Bible. And this movement helped push more and more people into literacy. This was the time that, well, we're maybe not quite there, but eventually peasants, slaves were given versions of the Bible. And I have the Slave Bible. And this, when I first bought this, when it was first published, I don't think there was a comprehensive version of the Slave Bible that I had ever seen. And I was horrified to learn this existed, because this was a version of the Bible that they took out. They took out freedom, and they took out the fact that everyone is equal. They took out, it was selected parts for the use of Negro slaves of the British West India Islands. And holding the paradox of the evil of that, because they were given a part of it because of this period of time, that led to the freeing of slaves, at least in our country. And so it could not have happened the other way around, right? It could not have happened that society believed that, it's not right that they're allowed to be a Christian, but they're not allowed to be free. And so first became that they were allowed to be converted. And see throughout history here, like, well, first it was just everybody, and then it was the lower classes, and then it was maybe we actually are all equal, and we're still fighting in the culture wars of the leftovers of that today. So how did Puritanism shape early constitutional ideals? So like I said, we went from a covenant theory to a social contract theory. We still live in a social contract theory today. We went from congregational self-governance to democratic institutions. We believe in democracy now, right? Even though the United States is more of a republic than a democracy, we have a focus now. This led to a focus on literacy and law, the first public education laws. And I didn't look too much into this, but in 1647, the Old Deluder Satan Act was a part of establishing public schools and communities, because the belief at the time, and still today, is that Satan lurks about the surface of the earth, and being illiterate or uneducated made you susceptible to the disillusionment of Satan. And if you think from a metaphysical lens, that's true. And to put it into law meant legal literacy, created a culture of knowing and arguing the law. This led to people having a moral law and a rule of law. We still live under a rule of law. And this, I think, is fascinating. Hold the paradox of this one, because a rule of law meant that all individuals, institutions, and entities are accountable and governed by laws, as opposed to arbitrary decisions of individuals. So laws, instead of decisions of individuals behind the scenes, like the clergy of your community or the voting members of your community, which knew how to read, knew how to interpret the Bible, it now meant that it was equally enforced and publicly known across all people. And this led into the belief that all people are created equal. Of course, like I said, Jesus taught that. We got away from that. And we're weaving in history. I'm going to get into like the patterns of history through spiral dynamics later, but that's the theory it's evolution. It's that every stage of history builds on itself. And so because I think the rule of law and codified constitutions and justice systems based on accountability and structure was the next point in the evolution. And if we can maintain that, which I'm going to say it again, publicly known, equally enforced, and independently adjusted laws guide society rather than arbitrary decisions based on individuals. It's a great idea, but does that sound familiar in some of the struggles we have today? Like the shadow government we know is alive and well. It's right in front of us. So this also led to religious dissent and freedom. Because the Puritans were so strict, a lot of dissenters and the persecution of dissenters actually led to a powerful pushback and expansion of religious freedom. Like I said, the founding fathers were living in some of these Puritan colonies, and when they came, this all fed into the revolutionary thinking. This is the First Amendment became the First Amendment, is because they were like, let's not do that again. So history is building on itself. Rhode Island and Pennsylvania were founded by religious dissenters from Puritans who helped shape America's pluralist ideals. So why was pluralism so important? The Great Awakening that led to more people being allowed to have faith led to everyone has a right to their views and no single authority should silence others. Like led to the First Amendment, which is the freedom of speech, freedom of religion. It doesn't mean one is right over the other. That was the case before this became the cultural norm. It was the case that only certain people were allowed to vote. And of course, women didn't have the right to vote for another several hundred years. But it has taken a long time to even get to the point where we are today of it being a norm to fall back on, a societal norm to fall back on. Like, no, all men are created equal. Men and women are created equal. And that just wasn't the case before. This Great Awakening that influenced all the denominations that came from that, Protestantism, the Baptists. I mean, I grew up in a congregation that was like, no, all those denominations are wrong. And looking back, like we were just another denomination. But I started to see maybe the breaking up of the church and the splitting of the congregations because of the extreme rule of Puritan thinking actually helped save the religion. Because, you know, I watched a video recently, tangent, but Eric Weinstein thinks that we are heading back into another global war because of the way history repeats itself. And, oh man, my caffeine brain just lost my train of thought for sure. Because and see, that's what I did. I branched off too fast. But because history repeats itself, oh man, I lost it. I hope we can edit this out. Developed democratic ideals. Okay, so anyone could be saved. And the growing population too, that's something I noted as you were speaking, and maybe that's where I'm getting his idea, is that because the population of the earth has grown to the point it has, it is a pattern among humans that too many cooks in the kitchen, for lack of a better term, will create conflict. And this is a good example of that. It's coming back full circle. Like the church, when we were established as the New England colonies, had a certain rule, and for the belief system to evolve, it had to be broken. And again, here we are. We have added billions of people to the earth since this time, and the same rule applies. We have so many warring cultural tribes that conflict is bound to happen. And so just to tie back, like maybe that's how goodness is kept alive, is that did breaking up Christianity during this time, did adding more denominations keep it alive? And the belief system I grew up with was like, they're all wrong. There's only one true faith. And maybe, you know, going back to monotheism, polytheism, there's a benefit to both. And I think holding the paradox of, well, how do we not be that wrong person and demonize our neighbor for a different way of thinking? So what was really interesting to me is what that shift felt like on the ground. So before the Puritan influence, or before this revolution, the evangelical revivalism, there was intellectual, sermon heavy, shifted into emotional, spontaneous, and music-filled conversion experiences. Authority figures were educated ministers and tied to civic life. The founders wanted a separation of church and state, and part of what led to this revival of faith was traveling preachers giving emotional sermons that encouraged people that you as a person have a pathway to freedom, not through the clergy or the power figures of your community. Membership was not limited to visible saints or the elite or the powerful. It was open to anyone. And so the context, I'm not going to get into that. But so pluralism and the context of what that looked like for families and in our food systems and how we organize society was that it sounds like we became more okay with other types of ways of life. And so this matters because it reduced conflict by encouraging dialogue instead of dominance. The breaking down, like to speak of the breaking down of hierarchy and then the building up of hierarchy. It's almost like every time there's a breakdown, there's a new rebuilding, because it's like this universal law of nature. Don't you think like there's this order? I could go into plants and the metaphor of that, but so that led to the First Amendment and some of the laws that we have today. So how did it shape U.S. politics that we see today? What got us here was, actually, I'm going to go into the First Amendment later. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Especially Puritan churches at that point leading up to 1700 had become ritualistic and distant. So this spiritual search for a deeper meaning beyond cold rationalism is what led to more and more people essentially liberating themselves, because the traditional religious control and the diversity of people coming into this land made control harder to maintain. So going back to the population issues, I think when people compare the United States to smaller European countries, I'm like, it's like apples and oranges, like that the old culture that has survived among your other little cultures for thousands of years, I mean, hundreds or thousands of years, compared to this 250-year-old baby country where we have 50 states now and they're all very, very different. It's hard to think, it's hard to compare really without understanding the full context of how we are really different. So now we're into the period where salvation was accessible to all individuals, no matter what status, gender, anything that you were. So, and then I have some people, I'm not going to go into some of the early revolutionaries, the early 1700s revolutionaries that led to some of this belief, but it was a lot of, I mean, I used to be a missionary. I understand the pros and cons of going out and preaching the good word. But because of this sense of personal and emotional sovereignty that was growing in this period of time in that land, if you think about before this period of time, religious authority was hierarchical, and personal experience of conversion and emotional engagement with faith, and a direct relationship with God, I think is what led to some of this.
Mm.
Seeing ourselves as sinful and unable to have divine grace given to us. And so I'm kind of being redundant here, but I think that the difference between the Puritan ideal and the message that Jesus actually led is worth understanding, because our country is based on this spiritual warfare, it seems. And we still live in that. I have such a personal experience, like Raquel, you mentioned being a descendant of the slave trade that came from Africa to the Caribbean. My family, I have actually, right before we started, I found this, I'm like, I know it's right here. My family came to Virginia from England in the 1640s to 1670s. I have a history here of my family thanks to a database from a family member of mine, Dan Evett. My maiden name is Evett, from Texas. He kept records from 1266 all the way up to 1749. So 1266 is the first ancestor I know of that was buried in England. So I have a British background. My mom's side, on my dad's side, my mom's side is German, and I married of someone of Swedish ancestry, which is why my last name is Liljegren. But it's so cool that you're in Virginia because that tied to me. He was a soldier in the Irish Wars. Thomas Evett was born in 1640 in Ireland, because several British migration, they would leave from Ireland. I learned that from a British friend of mine, because he's like, oh, if you have ancestry in Ireland, that's probably why. But then he died in Virginia. So that at that point, I don't know why he left or why he ended up here. Especially because my dad told me that among this time, if you had certain experience in fighting and as a soldier, you had land rights. And so going back to what ownership gave you, like, I don't know what you had to do to get that. And that's how a lot of this country was from too. If you had experience being a soldier, you were given more land, essentially, in the colonization of this country. So I think, again, just to take a step back and acknowledge that we are friends in 2025, and we would not have been friends 200 years ago. And I think, speaking to like the way history builds on itself, how can we take how do I know that this is my place? That's the question. And maybe that's a journal prompt that we're trying to give practices. And conscious flow writing, like you mentioned, just setting a timer for 10 minutes. I'm going to answer this question. How do I know where I am? Like, however you want to answer that question, see what comes out in a 10-minute writing. And whether it's physical, spiritual, historical, all of those factors play into effect. So, yeah, Jesus' teaching are not Puritanism, and that's just a point that I wanted to make. And this is a funny thing. So the Puritans thought that the Church of England was too corrupt, too Catholic, too worldly, and too spiritually impure. And we have had, we still ask those questions today. How did the Church of England separate from the Catholic Church? Henry VIII decided he wanted to get divorced and was like, I'm going to change the law. And that's just how it works. That's just the way people in power shape our history. People say history was written by the victors. Well, I think it's written by the historians who are able to, and that's why I say, like, because this is ChatGPT organized, at least in my flow here, I want people to say, this is how I'm relating to this history, or this is how I'm relating to that policy, or this is the way this is all working in my life. And so the way we see some of that play out in American culture today is still education and literacy. We agree to social contracts via law. This work ethic, this meritocracy that we still live under the rule of. The myth of meritocracy is really, really interesting. And this is a big conversation today of, is it true that you work hard and that's how success is found? And it's like, well, sometimes, but no, it's not a natural, it's more of a natural law than it is like something that can be put into policy, really. Moral idealism and local government. So I think, I have a timeline here broken up from 16, from just throughout history, but I'm just going to skip through that. And if we have questions about certain things, because leading up to the 1700s and the Enlightenment influence was the Salem witch trials. And so it was like a climax of Puritan anxiety where people started to realize this isn't working. And in the natural order of things, it seems the pushback of that led to more freedoms, which led to more pushback of how should society actually work out. And this, like I said earlier, is what led to enslaved families seeking to follow Christ. And Christianity, I have a personal life journey with. I was born into a church that I realized at about 20, leading up to 20 years old, this is not a healthy environment. We're going to do an episode on that in the future. And I just shared a post last night on Facebook because yesterday was World Population Day. And it made me think about my experience as a human. It turned into a holiday because in like the 80s, the population of the world reached 5 billion. And they were like, hey, this is something to think about. And as of last night, it was like 8.1 billion. So it's still like, hey, this is something to think about. But the growing sentiment that we shouldn't be here, there's too many of us, we got to go. There is a huge spectrum of how people think that should be handled. During the pandemic, some conspiracy like ideas that were out there was like, this is intentional to cull the population of the world. Let us know how you think that should be handled. I'm not going to claim to have the answers, but it's something that's happening today. And I'm going to go back to the evolution of people believing that all people should be free and equal. Because Puritanism and slavery coexisted, because religious leaders owned slaves, people were able to acknowledge the paradox and push towards better. That's the theme. That's the theme that we're seeing throughout history. Family separation, separating humans from their families, taking people out of their homeland and putting them in another one. And this is a note that I think is very important to highlight. This is one of the most profound legacies of early colonial Christianity, that people started to believe for the first time that slaves deserved freedom. We started to believe for the first time that we were equal. This was a big turning point in the emotional resistance. So the spiritual resistance to abolitionism, 1865, Juneteenth. Okay, Juneteenth was last month. It became a national holiday in 2021, but it was the first Juneteenth was in 1866 in Texas, because in 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. And on June 19th, that's why we chose that as the holiday. The Union Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and announced the end of slavery. That was 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Emancipation Proclamation didn't have much hold in southern states because it was still such a embedded part of the culture. And that's worthy of remembering, because even in the colonization of Washington State, where I'm at, they made certain, like, okay, you're going to go to a reservation, or okay, here's a new policy of where we're going to put you, Native people that we are displacing. And the lull in the federal, process of things meant that, okay, we're going to put you here. And then the sludge of governance means that in the time between, like I said, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and finally a Union guy was like, hey, no, slavery's over. And the next day, the slaves of Texas celebrated the first Juneteenth. And I think that's why it's cool to see the evolution of it come to a national scale. Because again, the sludge of governance, especially large governance, people starved, in the Coast Salish tribes, because they were displaced by the government saying, we'll feed you, don't worry, we'll send you food. They took them out of their homeland where they knew how to hunt, fish, live, forage. They put them in a new place and said, we'll take care of you. And they didn't for like 2 years. So then you have people dying of starvation because of policies like this. And again, history repeating itself, echoing. Tensions today. The contradictions of American religious history. Again, living in paradox. How can faith traditions that once justified slavery, we used the Bible so that we could enslave people? How can faith traditions that once justified slavery now lead to radical reconciliation? They did on a societal level. I can't really rationalize it in my one brain, but as a society, that's what we did. And this period and still today, there's a growing number of nones, N-O-N-E-S, people with no religious affiliation, to reflect the disillusionment with institutional religion. And again, the theme of institutional religion causing oppression, the breaking of it, keeping faith alive, and then the reforming of new ideas have helped this evolution of the modern belief that we are all created equal and deserve equal treatment of the laws. And so this is still echoed today in the Faith for Justice movement. Here's the actual breakdown of the First Amendment. So no religious tests. People in governance, it is not, we cannot require people with certain religious power, not religious, government power, to be a Christian or any religion. That religious test cannot be a part of their part of power. And no established religion or in free religious practice. So an establishment clause in the First Amendment says the government cannot establish a national religion of favor of one religion or the other. I think this is an important thing to talk about today, because while Christianity is such a big part of our modern society, the push for morally obligated policies is on the rise. And so it's worth talking about and us asking ourselves, how do we want to govern ourselves? It's harder. There's more of us. There's a lot more of us now. And so the conversation's getting messier. But and then the free exercise clause means that citizens can freely practice their religion. The government cannot restrict religious beliefs, but it can restrict actions if they violate law. Again, with the social contract rule, We are agreeing to all equally live by the terms of the law. But again, the rules for the but not for me, like the people with individual power in our government. It's like, can we push this back in their face a little bit?
That's right.
Polygamy outlawed, discrimination outlawed, abuse outlawed, hate crimes outlawed. But it's well according to these beliefs.
Right.
And so what does true freedom look like? What does true justice look like? That's why I was so interested in the differences between Jesus's teachings and the Puritan teachings, because it's like, how did this happen? How did their deep conviction in one faith lead to more oppression of faith and less freedom? So there was a lot of religious tension, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to reflect, only church members could vote. Church attendance was mandatory. Religious dissent was punished, including exile. And the Salem witch trials, which became like the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when religious authority is unchecked. So this created a long-standing colonial awareness of religious abuse, especially in New England. And so that's what led to, I mean, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams are all people who descended from Puritans, lived in Puritan ideals, and especially Thomas Jefferson, who really called for a wall of separation between church and state. So the same but different, holding paradox in the Puritan theocracy was a society by God's law, and the founders really tried to establish a separation between church and state, and still the flavors left over, like the work ethic, like there was belief as a private right versus a social danger, like this we're hard to control. Okay, like I said earlier, people will die for their sovereignty. And so even within families, even within, where I'm talking about the microcosm of the United States, but again, the microcosm of one state, one county, one village, one household, every layer of that is going to have different effects on how this really plays out in their lives. So to highlight this section for me is that our founders put in deliberate safeguards against the kind of religious domination and moral coercion that the Puritans practiced. Did that work out? That's the question. So I mentioned spiral dynamics. Spiral dynamics in Ken Wilber's Spiral Dynamics and Theory of Everything takes patterns of history and he frames it into colors. And I did not start timing my Raquel. I don't even know how much I passed.
No, you're good. No, you're still good. And I've just for those of you watching, I was taking notes so that I can, when we come together again, I just want to highlight some things. Okay. But I think you're good. I think we're good on time.
I don't want to go too much into the colors because this isn't I don't know and study spiral dynamics enough to really teach on it, but I'm very quickly going to go over it just to paint a picture of a model. And I love the phrase, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Okay, so this is my chunk where I'm like, this is a useful model. And so frame in your mind just the spiraling of patterns here. So in his model, he starts with beige. I'm going to say the color, the stage, and the description. The color beige is the stage survival. It's instinctive in your pre-social time. Purple is the tribal stage. This is a magical, animistic clan loyalty. The color red is an egocentric stage. It's a power-driven warrior culture. And again, every layer builds on the previous layer and incorporates new qualities. So take all that and you add in a blue layer of the traditional stage, order, hierarchy, moral absolutism. This is the Puritan evolution there. And orange stage is the irrational stage. So that led to the scientific age, right? The scientific, individualistic, capitalistic, Enlightenment era that happened there. Then you had green, the pluralistic stage. Equality, community, postmodernism. Like I said, pluralism was the first time we started to think there's not a right way above another. We actually can all coexist with different belief systems. You add on the yellow, the integral stage, systems thinking, integration of all levels. And turquoise is the final holistic stage, global consciousness, spirituality, and action. I think we're living in like AI. Hello, it's not going away. Globalism and in the AI technology and the technology our millennial brains just can't get away from is how do we look back at all of those stages and incorporate each one of them in a way that doesn't demonize. I think that's what we see so much in the modern culture wars is we are demonizing people who are still living on another part of the spiral. So I'm not going to get into where I mentioned where Puritanism fits, where we're going from here. But the mindset, the big mindset shift that happened here is we went from blue, they had God's law and moral order, the law of moral order, into orange. They were our view of Puritanism, we might say they were repressive, and the legal outlook is that this is the law of individual freedom. And then into the green, if we were looking back in the green phase, we would look back on Puritans and say they were colonizers. This is the law, our modern law of inclusive justice. They were colonizers, but that's looking at it from the green lens. But if we were to look at Puritans from the yellow lens, we might say they were one chapter in our evolution. And so the law that we might apply looking on that lens is we have to be, our law now is adaptable, integral, and descending old dualities. Because we have our own dualities. I think it's hard enough to look back at history and say, that's right and that's wrong. Like, how the hell would you know? People say a lot, like, if I was a German in Nazi Germany, I wouldn't have done that. And it's like, I pulled off this book as you were talking earlier from my bookshelf. I haven't read it yet, but I've skimmed through it. It's called White Mother to a Dark Race. I got it because, so I said I grew up in Missouri and I moved to Washington State. Native culture, so Coast Salish people, several of their traditions that I got to witness living in this part of the world, it's alive and well, not in a way that I was taught as a kid in Missouri with no visible representation of healthy Native American culture. And there is a boarding school here, the Spokane, oh my gosh, it used to be the Fort of Spokane. And then they turned it in the early 1900s into an Indian boarding school. And they used white women who were in their heart wanted to be good teachers, good parts of society, to train these children that we took off the reservation. First, we put them in reservations, and then we take their children and we put them in boarding schools. And I cannot tell you that if I were a 20-year-old because when I was a kid, I used to always want to be a teacher. If I was a 20-year-old in 1901 and someone offered me a job at a boarding school to help what they taught these women, help them overcome their savagery, right? We were there to teach them a better way of life. We came out of all of this old Puritan thinking with, no, everyone deserves to have an access to faith. This was some people's idea of their access to faith. We were going to give it to them. Yes, white savior complex, all the things that go into that. But I'm just highlighting that be very careful of looking back history and saying that you would do it differently, because I think that's where we're at in the spiral of this evolution of spirituality and law, is that we at this point have the opportunity to integrate the history that we're talking about here everywhere in our current United States history. We ask ourselves now, and that's always been the question, right? All you have is the moment. And so I hope this episode is us taking a collective moment to say, okay, this is where we're at. Where do we go from here? So the Industrial Revolution. So now we're getting into, we've gone to the 1730s, all the way to 1740s, 60s. The Industrial Revolution, which some people say started in the 1760s after the Great Awakening, leading all the way into the 1840s. and then I think still evolved leading up into 1900. Do you have what's coming up for you?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I wrote some notes about like the seeing the before, or like the origin story of the US, and then now where we are now. It's interesting how they say we are the land of the free, home of the brave, because like there's all this mythology around the US. And for those who are not in US culture, either because they immigrated here or because you're just listening from another part of the world, like there's this always American dream, and there's so much built up around it, but then seeing the seedlings and what created it and all of that. So I wanted to reference that land of the free, home of the brave is this big thing that's like, oh yeah, we're so badass. And talking about, I think you mentioned, I think your, I don't even know, great something ancestor from Ireland, and then how he had land rights here. It just because of the war, the fighting or something. What that came up to me was veterans, how veterans is such a big thing here in the US. We always got to support our veterans. We always got to support those who fought for us. But it wasn't the case when Black people fought in certain wars. So talking about, a note I made was freedom is the last to come because of all the containment and the control that we've been subjected to. So it's like this idea of freedom, of an American dream, of wealth, of religion, of, yeah, you can say whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. Everything is play here, but not for everyone, not at all times, not in all places. Psych, you've been duped, prank, punked. Like,
Yeah.
it's this interesting the dynamic, the paradox. And oh, that was my other note, was that they meaning society or those in power and wealth, want to remove paradox, whether that's queerness, whether that's religiosity, whether that's whatever it is, because if it's just either or, it makes it easier. There are those in power, there are those with no power. Those are Blacks, those are whites, those are in this thing and that thing. And it's like, it's easier to control that way. And so we in this conversation are trying to hold the paradox, the and both, because it's harder to live in that diverse rewilding. And then the last note I had, because I had a blog post about this, was about the 13th Amendment and how this indentured, I know it's not about indentured servitude, but I was combining indentured servitude with slavery, and how like that's what working in a 9 to 5 is, or people who migrate, literally for a better life here. This idea that if you work hard enough, and I think you mentioned this as well, that's BS. Meritocracy is BS, because we didn't choose to opt into the social contract, and yet we are told that we have choices, but they're not real choices. And so even though we're not slaves as the previous definition, or like as we saw, but we are still in systems of containment, not systems of freedom. So yeah, those were things that I was picking up on that you were putting down. So
yeah, thank you. Because that's a good point to clarify, because the ancestor that fought in the Irish Wars, gosh, my throat is getting dry.
The coffee. No, I'm kidding.
It is. I drank. It helped me wake up. But according to my dad, he most likely had land ownership rights in the land he came from. And so that, comparing that to some of my friends here in Washington State, came from ancestors who were given 500,000, more than 1,000-acre parcels, because they were a part of the colonization of this land. So we live in that, well, who conquered it? They get rights. And the illusion of freedom and all that. So the question my dad was posing is, why did he leave what could have been a good life for him? in England or Ireland or wherever he was. And I don't know the answer to that question. And because when they came here and landed in Virginia, I imagine it wasn't easy. And then my ancestors kind of continued to, I have the line all the way to Missouri. And I think that's one reason I'm so fascinated by the pioneer era. And I was born and ended up being raised in around Independence, Missouri. And I had a house there, and the city of three trails kind of, my mind was always in that, wow, what's out west? And I think just living in this leftover manifest destiny culture of I'm so interested in how we rewrite a new destiny, how we manifest a new destiny for American culture, because we've been given these old dualistic systems. And mentioning the 13th Amendment, part of it was it allowed slaves to enroll in the military. And it's like, well, is that trading in one servitude for another? Absolutely. And that at the same time allowed slaves to become people of power in the military and then get rights and land and access after that. Just like the slivers of the Bible that they were given led to a cultural norm of, hey, we're living in a paradox here. Don't they deserve to be free too? The free market. I mean, LOL, I just wrote that. The free market. It's this illusion. And then getting into the Industrial Revolution, they were called robber barons, because the people that founded, like the steel, I'm sure the book that you mentioned earlier gets into that. They were a part of shaping our society at a very vulnerable, powerful time. And we are living in that culture, that leftover culture of, I heard an interview with Warren Buffett and Bill Gates explain very logically, and well, yes, capitalism has losers. I am curious why who those losers are. And it seems that the people connected most with the earth and the natural cycles and the agrarian lifestyle that we had before the industrialization, I think they're the losers. And the urbanization, you mentioned that earlier too, was one of the most profound population shifts in our American history, because the majority of people were living in land-based, community supported systems, and you took people away from their land, you took children away from their families and put them into factories. And then we did it to ourselves, just like we did it to the native children, and in a very different way. I'm not saying that it was the same. But yeah, that living in the 8 to 5, I have an 8 to 5 and 9 to 5. I have an 8 to 5. And it's a lot of time that I don't get to focus on what I want to do. And I think that's why your work is so important to me, because you're helping people of our generation who have lived in total confusion. And I probably get to that at some point in here. Like I part of my awakening in my own body came from the emergency alarm bells internally saying, you don't know who you are. You don't know what you're doing. Where am I? What's going on? Because the overwhelm, I have clear memories of being a child and connecting with the grass and the sunsets. And I was very blessed to grow up out in the country. I didn't really understand. I like seeing people camp out there. I was like, why are they coming out here to like camp in the cow fields? But I get it now. Like I live in an urban center. I hear the highway and like generators all the time. And we are the millennials. Oh my gosh, Justin just sent me this documentary this week of how millennials are the new cancer generation.
Oh no.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but excited because we have been so polluted from our birth. I mean, after we were talking about that, and I was like, it sucks. I mean, like my family members getting cancer at 40, but our grandma eating junk food through her 60s, 70s, and 80s and never getting cancer is, the way she was raised was so different than the way we have been raised, and the pollution, the microplastics, all of it. Food became not food in my parents' generation. Like that's one reason I'm so focused on what is our food? Can we clean up our food? So I could dive into the Industrial Revolution into now, but I want to do a time check.
Yeah, I don't know if this is gonna cut us off because I feel like we started at 9:40 something. So but I don't know how long Google Meets goes for. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess we can just keep going.
Do we offer? Do you want to offer journal prompts? Because I don't want to. If we do get cut off, I'd rather us get cut off done semi than not. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. So here's a few questions that might be a good journal prompt. And I know I said one earlier, but the integrative thinking, that the holistic level that I mentioned earlier, how can we integrate all of these levels? How can we integrate all of these paradoxes that we see throughout history and the paradox we live in today? So prompt number 1 out of 3. How do we create a society that balances order, liberty, and inclusion? Prompt number 2. Can we respect tradition and reform outdated systems? And prompt number 3. Can we hold moral clarity without authoritarianism? Because I think that one is so important, because moral clarity seems like it's been the question of our race forever. We govern ourselves in a good way. I mentioned being witness to the Coast Salish tribes of Western Washington, and one of the before and after things that changed my life was witnessing the tribal canoe journey. And it was all of the water faring tribes coming together at one point and canoeing and to meet at one place. And the journey was several weeks. And so every time they stopped, there was like a map of where they would stop. And the practice that I witnessed over and over again was people, before they got off of the canoe and made it to land, while they were still in the canoe in the water, there was an exchange, a verbal exchange from people on the land and people on the water. And the travelers saying, we are coming in a good way. That those words echo all the time for me, like, in a good way. How can we do this in a good way? And going back to, there might not be a right way to live.
Yeah.
It's the wrong way to live. And so long as trying in a good way and practicing what I witnessed is like, we are going to practice and remember in our culture, in our rituals, in our society, how to have this exchange in a good way. And community is that check. So
I love that. I want to offer my 3 last prompts to wrap up. And I was telling Sarah, I'm like, I like alliteration where I can. So we don't have to be that cute, but I try. So one is center. So like, what grounds you? 2 is consciousness, what nourishes you. And then 3 is creativity, what inspires you. So I hope that these are 3 kind of pillars: the centering, the consciousness, the creativity, that I feel like we need, or are helpful in what we're all becoming. So those are my last 3 prompts that I'd like to offer. Do we wrap up? Do you want to wrap us up? Because I felt like we opened a lot there.
Yeah, we did. And the last practice I'll add to that is, aside from the journal prompts that I shared, sense meditation. You mentioned grounding earlier. Opening all of our senses. Thing I can smell. What is everything I can see? What is everything I can feel? And doing that at a place I was taught to call a sit spot. Many people probably already have a sit spot. It's a spot that they go outside and they return to over and over again. I think that is the definition of sacred wisdom, is having a place, going back to placemaking, a place you can go that opens you up in your stillness. And the well that is always there and available to you is a practice of tapping into and feeling and allowing what is to be. And that is the hardest thing that we get so caught up in. I was thinking yesterday during World Population Day, we forget about this animate force of nature and spirit that moves through all things, that is that collective, like the striving for equality that I think we're still struggling with. So being able to revolutionize love, it starts with yourself and allowing yourself the space to go be, I think is the most important thing you can do. And to befriend your neighbors. I was learning about a disaster, like what do we do if not more natural disasters? And the number one prompt that I just kept hearing was befriend your neighbors, learn how to communicate, learn how to have tough conversations, learn how to hold paradox between negative and positive, and learn how to interpret data versus interpretation. Because the way, like we talked about, the Puritans, the robber barons, that I'll probably maybe make a separate video about the whole industrial age and bringing it all together. But there is such paradox in the culture wars and the institutional crisis, and there is a spiritual revival happening. But where it goes is up to us. So thank you for opening this portal into our very messy history, and I hope this conversation has allowed little bits of ways to help you practice improving capacity and resilience and softness. And I mean, we came up with so many potential definitions for capacity: how to honor our grieving, how to be intentional, how to take our time and fight against instant gratification culture, how to build discernment within yourself and bring back rites of passage that allow us to put moments in the chaos that help us organize so that we can hold both hand and stop thinking that things are either or. And yeah, softness is strength, really.
Oh, that was beautiful. Well, we'll wrap up here, and we'll keep going. Our goal is to do a year, so there will be 12. We're on the second one, and I guess on to the next one. We'll see you all, hear you all, feel you all, be with you all in the next one.